Well, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is currently in Tbilisi and has hailed the vote there as free and democratic. His comments have put him out of step with the rest of the EU, Brussels voicing its concern about the integrity of the vote. Well, Georgian, our Europe editor, is with me to discuss this. And Orban, then, a perennial side in the thorn in the side, rather, of the leaders of the European Union. And this is, I suppose, no exception.
Well, it's interesting, Nadia, that the Georgian government itself is interpreting Orban's visit as basically part of Orban's rotating presidency of the European Union. So the Georgian Prime Minister said it's particularly significant that the Prime Minister's visit coincides with Hungary's presidency of the Council of the European Union. In the light of what Kobakhidze says, I'm slightly surprised that there hasn't been a comment or a tweet from, for example, the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Policy to say, hang on a minute, I'm actually the one who represents the EU 27, not Viktor Orban. And similarly, the President of the EU Council, Charles Michel, he's tweeted about Georgia, but not about this specific mission of Orban, where Orban, again, appears to be, at least on the optics of it, trying to represent the EU as a whole. And you remember that Orban got into quite a lot of trouble with other EU leaders and with MEPs at the European Parliament earlier this summer when he conducted this solo diplomatic mission on Ukraine, when he went to see Zelensky, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump. So this is, I suppose, of a piece with that visit earlier this summer. But like I said, I'm slightly surprised that there hasn't been as much reaction from the EU institutions themselves on what Orban optically seems to be doing here in Tbilisi.
Well, that's really interesting. And how worried overall would you say the EU is now about what we're seeing in Georgia?
Well, I mean, firstly, it obviously is observing how Viktor Orban himself is trying to build these alliances for a kind of politics that is alternative to the traditional kind of liberal democratic politics of the EU. And Orban sees not only Georgian Dream as that kind of politics, but also when you take leaders like Alexander Vučić in Serbia or Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic or Robert Fico in Slovakia, Orban is trying to build this sort of group of political forces to challenge the EU, and that is something that the EU is looking at, obviously with trepidation, because the EU wants liberal democracies to join the European Union, and Georgia has actually started it was granted candidate status to join the EU in December of 2023, having previously applied for EU membership. And you've got to remember that the war in Ukraine has really given more impetus to this whole EU enlargement process. So after the war began, you saw several countries either applying or kind of speeding up their whole EU integration process. And Georgia was no exception to that process until now. And so Georgia now is really at a very critical juncture in its whole EU path. And that's, of course, of huge importance to Brussels, which is why Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has been tweeting about this situation. And she says, following the parliamentary elections in Georgia, she said, the people of Georgia have a right to know what happened last night, what happened at the weekend, a right to see that irregularities are investigated swiftly, transparently, independently. The people of Georgia have been fighting for democracy, she says. So really underlining that very long path that Georgia has pursued for decades now, really, to try and get closer to the EU.
Georgian, our Europe editor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.